morning, Year 8. So this week we're going to be looking at the poem The Hunchback in the Park by Dylan Thomas as part of our identity poetry unit. So what you'll need in front of you is a pen and paper or a fresh Google Doc. You'll also need your identity poetry booklet in front of you, and that will help you to be able to make notes and locate ideas within the poem. Okay? So the thing about this week is we've got a bit of a change. We're looking at something really interesting. Whereas before we've looked at the way people view themselves, this time we're looking at how others view someone's identity. And in the case of this poem, it's a group of teenage boys identifying a homeless man who tends to be living in a park. And what we're going to be exploring is the effect of mocking somebody just because of their identity. Now I wanted to do something a little bit different this week and go back to the context of the poem. Now the context are the external factors which affect the meaning of the poem. So who was writing it, what time period it was written in, what was happening in the world at the same time that this poem is being written, and how they have an impact on the poem. Now if you have a look at that image on the left hand side, that is the pavilion right in the middle of Cwmdonkin Park. Now Cwmdonkin Park is a park in Wales, in South Wales, and it's behind the University of Wales campus, the Singleton campus in particular. And although you can't see it, if you trace your way through that path on the left hand side, you come to Singleton Hospital. There are walkways, as you can see from the top right hand side. There's the pavilion, as you can see from the left. There are also some hot houses where people have put these enormous great greenhouses, much like Kew Gardens, and they grow exotic plants in there. There's a play area, there's a lake, and there are swans there. And the person who wrote the poem, Dylan Thomas, who you can see in the bottom right image, he used to live right near this park as a boy, probably in one of those houses you can see concealed behind that tree. And he wrote about the idea that there was a man in a park, lots of people pass this man by, and he's largely ignored because he's a homeless man. But there are a group of boys who just can't help but mock and ridicule and tease him as he goes about his daily business. Okay. Now the thing about all of this being set in Wales is the language is very musical. You can probably hear it goes up and it goes down. Sometimes you can even hear there are extra syllables on each word. So instead of it being word, it goes word. So you can hear an up and a down, and as you read the poem, I want you to listen to those musical sounds. So just look out for those syllables. Now Dylan Thomas was writing between the periods of the 1930s and the 1950s, and what interested him about the condition were all these people who were misfits and outsiders. He wrote about drunks, about homeless people, about violence, and about people who were disappointed. And to try and offset all those negative ideas, he had an absolute passion for nature, and he often thought fondly about his childhood experiences. So just be aware of that. I'll be asking you a few questions later on in the Google Forms about what were the interests and priorities of Dylan Thomas. So you might just need to rewind it a little bit and make a few notes so you know what his interests were. Okay? Right, so we're going to read the poem for the first time now. Now for me, this is the most exciting part of encountering a poem, because here you just get your gut instinct, your first impression. And what it allows you to do is to have a personal response to the poem. So no matter how much we analyse the language a little bit later on and develop our critical voice, I want you to remember your initial personal response to this poem. How does it make you think? How does it make you feel? I'll just give you a few seconds to read the instructions on the right hand side, and then I'll begin to read the poem to you. The hunchback in the park, a solitary mister, propped between trees and water, from the opening of the garden lock that lets the trees and the water enter, until the Sunday sombre bell at dark, eating bread from a newspaper, drinking water from the chained cup that the children filled with gravel in the fountain basin where I sailed my ship, slept at night in a dog kennel, but nobody chained him up. Like the park birds he came early, like the water he sat down. And mister, they called him, hey mister, the truant boys from the town running when he had heard them clearly, all out of sound. past lake and rockery, laughing when he shook his paper, hunchback in mockery, through the loud zoo of the willow groves, dodging the park keeper with his stick that picked up leaves, and the old dog sleeper alone between nurses and swans, while the boys among willows made the tigers jump out of their eyes to roar on the rockery stones, and the groves were blue with sailors, made all day until bell time. A woman figure, without fault, straight as a young elm, straight and tall from his crooked bones, that she might stand in the night after the locks and chains, all night in the unmade park, after the railings and shrubberies, the birds, the grass, the trees, the lake, and the wild boys, innocent as strawberries, had followed the hunchback to his kennel in the dark. So you've had a few minutes to think about your first impression of the hunchback. I'm just wondering where your sympathies lie with the young boys who are hunchback in mockery, who are mimicking the hunchback, or are they resting with the hunchback himself? Are you wondering, like me, why those nurses who are walking past don't stop the boys from their taunting and their cruel japes? What part of it do you think is the most upsetting part? Which line made you think about how this hunchback is experiencing this teasing? Or did you look at it like the poet at the end of it? You have a look at those last 3 lines and think, they're just kids. They're innocent. It's just a time of strawberries and summer fun. Have you ever mocked or bullied or taken the mickey out of somebody when you're with your friends? Did you mean it? Or would you never do something like that? These are all questions to help us think about our personal engagement. Now we're going to go to the second reading of the poem. So I'm going to read it to you again, and as you listen to the poem, I want you to feel the mood of the poem. And the mood are the feelings that you as a reader are getting from this poem. And I'm going to stop after each stanza. Now remember, a stanza is a unit of poetry, just like Miss Elliott explained to you last week. And after each stanza, what I'd like you to do is to draw an emoji next to that stanza that reflects the feelings best for you. And then if you can label that emoji with a really precise word, not just happy, sad, but desperate or excited, then that will help you to see how the mood tracks its way through the poem. Okay? So a lot of this is going to be about thinking before we write down. So have a look at the second bullet point. Think about how the best 3 words or phrases make you feel in that stanza, and write a short swan afterwards. Now a swan is a single word analysis. Remember, statement, example, zoom into your single word, explain 3 connotations, explain why you think the poet might want to have used that particular word to show that mood, and then write at the end your reaction. Okay, so here's the poem again. The hunchback in the park, a solitary mister, propped between trees and water, from the opening of the garden lock that lets the trees and water enter until the Sunday sombre bell at dark. So just pop your emoji next to that. And now label it with a word you think best sums up the feeling of that stanza. Stanza 2. Eating bread from a newspaper, drinking water from the chained cup that the children filled with gravel in the fountain basin where I sailed my ship, slept at night in a dog kennel, but nobody chained him up. Okay, so I'm going to read the third stanza now. If you need to just stop and pause to give yourself more chance to think about your emoji and your word you're going to use to describe the mood, then you do that. Don't feel you have to continue. Okay? Third stanza. Like the park birds he came early, like the water he sat down. And mister, they called. Hey mister! The truant boys from the town running when he had heard them clearly, on out of sound. Stanza 4. Past lake and rockery, laughing when he shook his paper, hunchback in mockery, through the loud zoo of the willow groves, dodging the park keeper with his stick that picked up leaves. stanza 5. And the old dog sleeper, alone, between nurses and swans, while the boys among willows made the tigers jump out of their eyes to roar on the rockery stones, and the groves were blue with sailors. Okay, a little bit of a change in mood in that one. Look for the words, particularly the verbs. They help you with mood. Stanza 6. Made all day until bell time, a woman figure without fault, straight as a young elm, straight and tall from his crooked bones, that she might stand in the night after the locks and chains. Drop down your emoji and then add your word. Okay, and now the last stanza. All night in the unmade park, after the railings and shrubberies, the birds, the grass, the trees, the lake, and the wild boys, innocent as strawberries, had followed the hunchback to his kennel in the dark. Okay, what do you think that final mood is? What's that last feeling the reader is leaving us with? There's no answer that's an accurate answer. It's just your personal response, how you've read and interpreted this poem. Okay, so what you're going to do now then is to do one of two things. You're either going to track the whole mood across the whole poem. How does it start? How does it change? How does it end? And then you might just bring out one phrase or one example that really shows the mood clearly. Or you're going to talk about what you think is the most powerful stanza that identifies the mood for you, and then write your swan on one paragraph. I'll leave you to do that. When you're ready, go on to the next slide. Now I have to tell you a little bit about Dylan Thomas. He was a bit of a drinker. He did love a beer or two. And he used to live in the Mumbles, which is a beautiful bay as part of the Swansea Bay in the west of Swansea. And he used to go down there for his drinking haunt with his friends, and as he was drinking he would hear the sad stories of what had brought a lot of those men from their homes. Problems with jobs, problems with not being able to meet expectations of families, problems of not being able to find a wife, or maybe a marriage splitting up. And so what he found was he was there with a lot of people who felt lowly, as if they were at the low point of their life. And the thing that Dylan Thomas wanted to do was to give a voice to people who were lowly. Now this is an important idea because we're going to be writing our own poems towards the end of the week, and I'd like you to think of a lowly person, perhaps an outsider or a misfit, and give them a voice in the way they feel that they don't have their voice for themselves. Now it doesn't literally mean they can't talk, they're mute. When you have somebody with a voice, you have somebody who has strong opinions and they're allowed to share them. So we're looking about people who have strong opinions, but they've been prevented from sharing them. So what I'd like you to do is to think about a time in history when someone or a movement has acted in a horrible way or shown a terrible attitude towards another person or a group. Something which makes them feel awful about their own identity. Now see if you can write down as many examples as you can think of. Interesting, isn't it? When you look back through history, you realise how many times through old history of over 100 years ago and recent history, as in yesterday, that this sort of experience is still going on. So on the left hand side you have a Nazi who's writing an anti-Jewish slogan on a Jewish-owned shop, and then below that you have a woman who's completely ignoring a homeless man on the street. And I wonder, are we all guilty of this at some point in our lives? Do we simply label someone's identity of homeless and then leave them to struggle with their own social problems? Now on the right hand side, the George Floyd incident, where a white American police officer killed George Floyd just because of his black identity, provoked the whole movement of the Black Lives Matter movement, which became a worldwide organisation aimed at raising awareness of the black identity. So these are very profound and clear examples where somebody's identity is being mocked, ignored, or threatened just because they are who they are. Right, this is where you're going to be a bit more independent now. You've had the poem read to you 2 times and now you're going to read it to yourself. If you can't find it, just go into Google Classroom in classwork and there's a copy that's been annotated there to try and help you as you can work your way through. Okay. Now, for the first layer, we were just getting the general ideas. We were looking at our first impression. The second reading, then, we started to look at the mood of the poem and thinking about whether it stayed the same or changed. This time we're going to look at who is telling the story, and in this case we have an omniscient narrator. Now I'm sure you've heard this word in RE before. It comes from the Latin. Omni means everything, and scient, sounds very similar to science, doesn't it, is where we have knowledge based. So essentially an omniscient narrator is a person who's telling a story who knows everything that is going on. And what I'd like you to do is to imagine that it's you. It's me. We're a bystander. We're standing back and we're looking at this hunchbacked homeless man being mocked and ridiculed on a daily basis by a group of teenage boys who are on a long summer holiday and don't have much else to do. Okay? So given this then, what is the benefit, do you think, of using that all-knowing omniscient narrator to tell the readers about a tramp who's been teased by young boys in a park? Jot down your first thoughts, and then I'd like to really struggle with this one, wrestle in your mind. Is there anything else? Think beyond the surface level here. So I'd like to try and do 2, possibly 3 different layers on this one. Right, so we know who's telling the story, and we've got some kind of impression about why that might be a helpful way of telling the story and what we gain from it. Okay? This time, in the 4th reading of the poem, we're going to look at the structure. And the structure literally means how the poem gives up its secrets to the reader. Because no poem gives its first answer, oh, we know exactly what you mean, in line 1. What poems do is they tell us a little bit of information in the first stanza, and then gradually more information is provided as we go throughout the poem, so that you and I have a journey as we go through the poem. We're trying to identify what the writer might be suggesting to us. It's a very personal experience. So in other words, if we were sitting in the classroom, you might have a totally different interpretation of this poem to the person who was sitting next to you. So what we're interested in is what you make of it and explaining your reasons why. Okay? So what we're going to do is go through each section of the poem, and we're going to do this as a shared exercise, you and me, and we're going to record when you learn about the hunchback and his identity as you read through, and at what point these ideas are suggested to you. So I'll go through the first couple. I'll read that first stanza again. Ready? The hunchback in the park, a solitary mister, propped between trees and water, from the opening of the garden lock that lets the trees and the water enter until the Sunday sombre bell at dark. Okay, so that's our first stanza. And the first thing we learn about him is that he is a solitary mister. Now the word solitary means that you're alone. It doesn't necessarily mean you're lonely, it just means you're on your own. So this might tell us something about his identity. It could suggest that maybe he's used to being alone, maybe he has to be alone, perhaps he's alone because nobody wants to touch him. There's a stigma. He's discriminated against because he's a person who has poor clothing, he's doing strange things like eating food out of a newspaper, which is the next part. So we're starting to gather a little bit of a picture about a man who's on his own, and we don't know whether he enjoys being alone or whether he hates it. There's no feeling given there yet. Okay? Then the next thing we know is he's propped between trees and water. So if you're propped up, it means that you have to lean against it. It's there as a support. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm starting to feel a little bit sorry about this man. He's on his own and he can't even stand up straight. I know that because in the title it suggests he's a hunchback, and now I've learned that he's propped. If you were resting or gently leaning, that might be different, but propped suggests he needs that tree to help him to stand up. And then as we go through that stanza a little bit more, we realise that he's there all day, every day until Sundays, when at dark there's a bell that's rung, and I imagine, I don't know, I'm just inferring here, that the park is closed at that time for Sunday night and probably open again on Monday morning. So this man is there all the time, every day, and that suggests to me that he might be a homeless person. So what I'm going to do now is go into the second stanza and see if my initial impressions are built up. So we know that he's eating bread from a newspaper. I mean, what kind of person eats bread from a newspaper? We read a newspaper and we eat bread at home in our own homes with our sandwiches, or we might have a nice sandwich packed up. Not him. He's eating bread, not bread with meat and vegetables, just bread. So he's obviously quite poor, and he's eating from a newspaper, so he doesn't have a plate. That suggests to me a homeless person or a tramp. Now, it wouldn't necessarily make me think of him being a homeless person. It might be somebody who's got a whole load of newspaper, they've put some bread in it, and they're going to the park to feed the swans. But the fact that this man is a solitary figure and he's needing to be propped up is starting to build a bigger picture for me. So I'm getting a clear idea of his identity now. He's a tramp or a homeless person who's alone and he's having to eat from newspaper. Okay, see if you can go through the next stanza, draw out that chart beneath, and it'll help you to follow the ideas as we're learning them throughout the poem. What does the poem gradually reveal to you? Now, some of you have expressed difficulty in converting your notes into paragraphs, so I thought we'd take this opportunity now to have a practice at that skill. So if you see in the top right hand side, what you're going to do is to take time. I don't want you to rush this one. You're going to produce a good paragraph, even if it takes you half an hour. Okay? Take time to write up your thoughts into a clear paragraph. Now, this will be useful for future lessons. So here is the question you're going to answer. How does the writer use the structure of the poem to make suggestions about the hunchback's identity? Now, there are two things we need to do here. So we've read the question. We are going to identify exactly what it's asking us to do. So we're asking, in what way does this poet, Dylan Thomas, use the way the ideas are gradually revealed, because we know that's what structure means, in this poem, to make your own suggestions as a reader about the hunchback's identity? Not how other people see the hunchback, but how the hunchback is described in the poem. Okay? And to help you out, I've provided you with some sentence starters on the left-hand side. So you could talk about the poet begins by revealing how the hunchback is, and then you could fill in your notes from there. Literally just write up into sentences what you've written down from your notes. And then you can, in the same sentence, you can then add gradually the reader realises that the man is a lonely person, or isolated, or a tramp, or disabled, or you can put in whatever you think there. And then if you notice on my model on the previous slide, I talked about what it suggests, what it implies, what we as the reader understand. So you're just going to say, this is what we find out, and this is what it makes us realise. Okay? And then in the same paragraph, you're just going to track, at the end, the poet leaves the reader to think. And a paragraph is about 5 or 6 sentences long. So have a practice of writing those notes up, answering that question, and using those sentence starters if you need to. So let's recap on what we've done so far then. We've listened to the poem to think about the ideas. We've then looked at the mood to identify the feelings in the poem. We've looked at who is telling the poem, and we know is an omniscient narrator. We looked at how the ideas are gradually revealed to us. That's the structure. And now we're zooming in and looking more closely at a short phrase or a word. And I think the best way of doing this is to look at the idea of metaphors. Now we know what a metaphor is already. A metaphor is where you compare two things so that the first becomes the second thing. Okay? So here's an example of a metaphor. Can you write it down? You can pause if you need to. Slept at night in a dog kennel, but nobody chained him up. Okay? So the two things that are being described have been swapped out as nouns. So when something's described as something else, like the swapping out of these nouns, if the dog kennel was not literally a dog kennel, we've got to ask ourselves, what else looks and acts like a dog kennel but houses humans? Now you could have all sorts of things for this, but the idea that came to my mind was it might be a prison cell. It's just got a concrete floor, it's quite dark, it's not really accommodating, warm or welcoming, it's a small space, there are lots of similarities. So when I started thinking, oh, now this man is sleeping in a dog kennel but nobody chained him up, because when you sleep in a prison cell, sometimes you are chained up, not necessarily in this country, but in many prison cells abroad, then it got me thinking, what might this metaphor reveal about this homeless man's past identity? And I thought, well, perhaps, as this is written in the 1930s, 40s or 50s, this man might have been a prisoner in the past. And then I thought, well, what major event happened in the 1930s and 40s? And then I twigged on to World War II. Now, I don't know if this is true, but my reading of it is that perhaps this man was a prisoner of war, and perhaps he was injured, and that's why he got his hunchback. Or maybe he had been a criminal and committed some sort of offence, like in our human interest poem, and this was his way of trying to regain his life after he'd been released from prison. Now suddenly, from my fifth reading of the poem, looking carefully at the metaphors, the language choices that the writer's using, it draws a different layer to this man's identity. He's not just homeless, he's now a man with a past, and where you want to choose to take that past is completely up to you. So what I'd like to do is just spend a few minutes looking at that dog kennel metaphor. What do you think that dog kennel might represent? What else looks and acts like a dog kennel but houses humans? What is this doing to this man's identity? What does it make him seem like? Just spend a minute or two. You can either develop on my idea, or you can take a completely different approach and write down your own thoughts. Okay, so as you've got this poem in front of you in your booklet, or you've gone onto Google Classroom in classwork, and you can see the poem there, highlight this metaphor. Done? Good. Now, at this point in the poem, the man's identity is seen differently. What do you think these words, underlined in red, have in common? So the poet compares the man's identity to a different, more relaxing theme this time, doesn't he? And how does this metaphor then change your picture of the hunchback's identity here? No longer a prisoner with a past, but by calling him this sort of person, naming him as part of the birds and part of the water, he then becomes much more linked to what kind of theme or idea? Have a think about it. So already when we were looking at language, we realised that it can add different layers to identity. And to give you the answers from the previous slide, those two words, birds and water, have the theme of nature in common. And it makes it seem as if the hunchback is part of nature. He doesn't want to be in society. Some homeless people choose not to live in a house. They prefer the freedom and the wildness of the open air. Perhaps this homeless person is just like that. So we can't make a judgment on this man's motivations, why he's homeless. We just have to observe, because we're that omniscient narrator, standing back and watching. Okay? So this time we're going to look at a simile rather than a metaphor. Now, whereas a metaphor is a comparison between two things where the first becomes the second, a simile is a comparison of two things where one is like the second. So here is our simile. Take a second just to highlight it. And it's a lovely simile because it draws so many connotations. So the wild boys, wildness of freedom, joy, youth, energy. You know what it's like in the summer holidays and you meet up with your friends. Those lovely long days that seem to stretch on and on and on, and you've got nothing structured to do with your time. It's a wonderful age of innocence, which is one of the main themes of the poem. But look at that idea of strawberries. The boys were as innocent as strawberries. Now obviously a strawberry can't be innocent because it doesn't have thoughts and feelings. So we're sort of personifying the strawberries there. But what else is like a strawberry that is innocent? So we're going to ask ourselves all sorts of things like, when a strawberry's out and about, look at the boy in the picture, look at the weather, look at the clothes he's wearing, what time of year might it be? What is innocent about that whole experience of eating strawberries? Now, strawberries remind lots of people of innocent, happier times. So you're just going to write down 3 connotations, experiences that you might have had at the time of strawberry eating. Okay? And what does the simile make you think about people in general, who then persecute other people simply because of their identity? Do you think they know that they are intimidating other people? Do you think it's just part of banter? Can we ever say that bullying is acceptable just because of somebody's identity and we were young? What do you think of that idea? How did you get on with your connotations of strawberries then? Whenever I think of strawberries, I always think of Wimbledon, because obviously very expensive. But strawberries come out just as Wimbledon comes on, and I love watching the tennis. Strawberries, going out with your family, picking them in the strawberry fields. Oh, fresh strawberries and cream. Do you dip yours into sugar? Really happy, joyful, relaxing times. You finally feel the warmth of the sun on your back. You know summer's near. You're just going to relax. What wonderful feelings. So one of the things you must do when you relax, of course, is to mock and ridicule other people who are not as good looking or as fortunate as you are, right? Or is it right? So what I'd like you to do on your final reading of the poem is put a bit of yourself into this. You're going to show your personal and critical views. Now, you don't have to answer all of these questions. I'd like to pick 2. As you do, I'd like to really carefully explain why you think what you think. So these are not one-word responses, nor are they short sentence answers. I'd like to write 2 or 3 sentences here to explain your reasons. So let's go through the first one as an example. Do you think the man has a choice to stay in the park at night? Now, on the one hand, I think he does have a choice, because he could go to a homeless shelter and he could be supported by the system. But on the other hand, he might have a fear of being with people, perhaps a mental health problem, and he quite enjoys the aloneness, being a solitary figure. Perhaps he enjoys being part of nature, as it mentioned in the metaphor that we read about earlier. So can you see what I've done there is I've given 2 or 3 reasons. Let's have a look at the next one now. How do you think the man feels as a result of the boy's constant taunting? It doesn't actually tell us directly what his feelings are, so you won't find a word that gives you an easy answer. You've got to read those last 2 or 3 lines, and from it, you're going to make an inference. You say, well, given this, how might this man feel as a reaction? And I'd like to explain your feelings. Okay? Next one then, which word best sums up how the hunchback feels about his identity as a homeless person? Nothingness? Does that sum it up? Or content? Do you think that might sum up his feelings? Would you say that he's reached a stage of acceptance about being homeless? Does he feel anger that other people see him as a homeless person? And no matter which one of those you choose, or you can even add your own if you want to, I'd like to give at least 2 reasons. Okay? The next one then, what does Dylan Thomas suggest to you personally about the impact of others' actions on someone's identity? So that's you just explaining your views. And then the final one, what do you think the take-home message of this poem is? What does it say to us about the way that people treat other people based on their identity? Again, 2 or 3 reasons, and then you're good to go. Right then, Year 8, we've covered a lot in this session today. We've looked at your personal response at the beginning, that first impression. Then we've looked at the mood, and we particularly focused on how verbs show us the changing mood of a poem. We then looked at the narrator, and the specific type of narrator we've looked at is the omniscient narrator, and that's a person who knows everything that's going on. We then thought about the structure, as the poem gradually reveals its secrets, the use of metaphor to change our impression of identity, and the same with similes. And then we've given our own personal interpretation at the end. Now, we are going to answer some of these questions in a Google form, so I'll be giving you a quiz on this. But a lot of the thinking that we've done in today's lesson, step by step, is actually going to help you enormously when you come to write your poem at the end of the week. So don't take shortcuts, because you'll just be shortchanging yourself. Do go through it methodically, and if you need to go back into the video, that's absolutely fine. is making sure that you're clear. If you have any questions, you can talk to your teachers either in your meets or you can ask them questions via email. So don't struggle with anything, ask, and then that will help you to be clearer. I hope you thoroughly enjoy this poem, and I have to say, Bore da gyd, that means goodbye everybody in Welsh.